The moment I heard that young man near the podium whisper to someone beside him that the quiet old fellow in the back probably hadn't done much during the war, something inside my chest tightened in a way that surprised even me. Not anger, exactly. I was too old for that kind of heat. It was something slower. Something heavier. Like a drawer sliding open in a room I had kept locked for half a lifetime. I remember the sound of the ceiling fans first. That slow circular hum above the Savannah Civic Auditorium. 3 of them turning lazy arcs beneath a tall cream-colored ceiling stained faintly by decades of summers. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper programs. Veterans Day ceremonies always carry a certain quiet weight to them. Not sadness exactly. More like a room where everyone knows a story is present even if no one says it out loud. Rows of metal folding chairs stretched across the polished wooden floor, their legs clicking softly whenever someone shifted their weight. American flags stood along the walls in neat intervals, their fabric hanging still in the warm air. Families filled the front rows. Children leaning against parents. Young reporters scribbling in small notebooks. Local officials with careful smiles. And scattered among them were the men who had once been young soldiers but now wore soft jackets and faded caps stitched with the names of wars most of those children only knew from history books. I sat near the back. That's usually where the quiet ones end up. Not because anyone puts us there. Just because it feels natural after a while. My hands rested on my lap with my old cap folded between them. The stitching on it had worn thin along the edges. My wife used to say it made me look like one of those men who kept a whole life hidden in the pockets of an old coat. She passed in '96. The cap stayed. From where I sat I could see the whole room. Sunlight leaked through the tall windows high on the brick wall, catching in dust that floated slowly above the chairs. The microphone at the front of the room gave a faint humming sound between speakers, that soft electrical buzz microphones always make when the room grows quiet. The mayor had already spoken. A retired colonel had told a long story about leadership and bravery in Korea. Everyone applauded politely. People like applause at ceremonies. It gives them a place to put their feelings. I watched a boy in the second row spinning the small flag they'd handed out at the door. His grandmother kept gently lowering his hand every time the stick started whistling through the air. Outside, somewhere beyond the old brick buildings downtown, I could hear distant traffic rolling along Bay Street. Savannah has a way of carrying sound softly like that. The young man near the podium was a reporter, I think. Early 30s maybe. Clean haircut, pressed shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to look busy. He leaned toward the woman beside him. That's when he said it. Not loudly. Just a casual murmur meant for one person. These back row guys probably just kept to themselves during the war. A small laugh followed. Not cruel. Just easy. The kind people give when they assume they're making a harmless observation. 2 people chuckled softly. One of the ceiling fans creaked as it turned. My fingers tightened slightly on the cap in my lap. I didn't look toward them. At my age you learn something important about moments like that. Most of the time they aren't meant to wound. They come from something softer. Incomplete pictures. Stories told too many times about a few visible heroes until people begin to believe history happened only on brightly lit stages. The ceremony moved on. Another speaker approached the microphone, adjusting it downward with a metallic squeak. His voice echoed gently across the room as he thanked the community, the veterans, the families who supported them. Programs rustled in people's hands. Someone coughed near the side wall. I kept watching the room the way old men do. Slowly. Taking it in. You'd be surprised how much life you can read in a quiet room when you stop trying to fill it with your own voice. There was a Marine in the third row with a chest full of medals shining under the lights. His daughter leaned against his shoulder. A Navy veteran sat 2 chairs ahead of me, turning his wedding ring slowly around his finger as the speeches continued. Near the front, a group of high school students shifted in their seats, trying their best to look respectful while their legs bounced with the energy only young people have. And behind the microphone, the young reporter eventually stepped forward himself. He wasn't giving a speech exactly. More like offering a few remarks before introducing the final part of the ceremony. His voice carried clearly through the old speakers mounted high along the walls. He talked about bravery, sacrifice, the visible heroes whose stories fill history books. He spoke well. People nodded. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added something about how some veterans naturally become the faces we remember, the leaders, the decorated officers, the men whose actions shaped battles. And others, he said with an easy shrug, well, they just did their jobs quietly and stayed out of the spotlight. He meant it kindly. You could hear that. But kindness doesn't always prevent a sentence from landing like a small stone in a quiet pond. A ripple passed through the back rows. Nothing dramatic. Just a few glances. A shifting of chairs. I looked down at my hands. My knuckles had grown larger over the years, the skin thinner, veins like faint blue threads beneath the surface. Funny the things you notice when you're old. The room applauded when he finished. Applause always fills the empty space where reflection might otherwise grow. The mayor returned to the microphone and cleared his throat. And now, he said, we'd like to offer any veterans here today the chance to share a brief memory if they'd like. That part always comes last. Most years no one stands. Men who carried things for decades rarely decide to unpack them in public rooms. For a moment the auditorium held its breath. Ceiling fans turned. A program slipped from someone's lap and fluttered softly against the floor. I wasn't planning to stand. Not really. At my age you make peace with the idea that most of your life will remain invisible to the rooms you pass through. There's a certain comfort in that. But something about the sound of that quiet chuckle earlier stayed with me. Not as an insult. More like a small misunderstanding waiting patiently to be corrected. My wife used to say I had a habit of fixing small things before they turned into larger problems. Loose hinges. Flickering lamps. Misplaced assumptions. My knees complained softly as I placed my hands on the sides of the folding chair. Metal creaked. The room didn't notice at first. Most people were still looking toward the front rows, expecting one of the decorated men to rise. But slowly, as I straightened and picked up my old cap, a few heads turned toward the back. I remember the feeling of the wooden floor beneath my shoes as I stepped into the aisle. Polished. Smooth. Each step carried a faint echo. The young reporter's eyes followed me with mild curiosity. Probably wondering who the quiet fellow from the back row was. I reached the microphone and paused for a moment, adjusting it slightly lower. The metal stand gave a gentle squeal. From where I stood I could see the whole room now. All those faces. Young. Old. Curious. Patient. Waiting. The ceiling fans hummed above us. The American flags along the walls hung still and watchful. I cleared my throat once. My name's Walter Bennett, I said softly into the microphone. The sound of my voice surprised me. Not because it shook. But because it didn't. It carried calmly across the auditorium, steady as the slow turning of those old ceiling fans. I rested my cap on the podium and folded my hands beside it. I don't have a heroic story, I continued. A few people leaned forward slightly. Just a memory from one night a long time ago. The room grew very still. And in that silence, I began to tell them about a repair tent, a cold stretch of darkness somewhere far from home, and the quiet kind of responsibility that rarely makes it into speeches. It was late when that night began, the kind of late where the air grows thin and sounds carry farther than they should. Our repair tent sat at the edge of the field, just past a row of trucks that had been driven hard all day and would be driven harder the next. The canvas walls breathed slowly with the wind. A single lantern hung from a nail in one of the wooden support posts, its light dim and yellow, barely strong enough to hold the darkness back. You learn quickly in places like that most of the war happens between the moments people write books about. It happens in the quiet hours. The hours when men tighten bolts, patch wires, check gauges, wipe oil from their hands, and keep machines alive so someone else can fly them, drive them, steer them into the moments history remembers. I was a mechanic. Not the kind who stands beside a gleaming airplane in photographs. The kind who spends long hours crouched in shadows, feeling metal through cold gloves and listening to engines the way a doctor listens to lungs. That night the wind pushed at the canvas of the tent and made it snap softly like distant sails. Outside, generators hummed in a low steady rhythm. Inside, there were 4 of us working. Nobody talked much. Men get quiet when they're tired enough. A wrench would turn. A tool would clink softly against the floorboards. Someone would cough. The lantern would sway just a little each time the wind slipped through the seams of the tent. I remember one of the boys, Tommy, I think his name was, sitting on an overturned crate while he cleaned grit out of a fuel line with a piece of cloth torn from an old shirt. He couldn't have been more than 19. Every few minutes he'd glance toward the open flap of the tent. Not because anything was happening. Just because when you're 19 and somewhere far from home, you keep expecting the world to suddenly change. Across from him, Sergeant Harris worked with slow careful hands over the exposed guts of a radio unit. He'd been a farmer before the war. You could tell by the way he moved, steady, patient, like a man used to fixing things that mattered. At one point the lantern flickered. Just once. The tent went dim for a heartbeat before the flame steadied again. No one said anything. But every man in that tent noticed. Because in places like that, small changes carry weight. The repair we were doing wasn't dramatic. Just a damaged coupling in a transport vehicle that needed to be moving again by morning. Supplies. Fuel. People. Machines carried all of it. If a machine failed, something else somewhere would feel the consequence. That's the part people forget when they imagine war as a line of heroic moments. It's really a long chain of quiet responsibilities. And every link matters. Around midnight someone outside started an engine to test it. The sound rolled across the dark field like distant thunder. Tommy flinched slightly. Sergeant Harris didn't even look up. He just kept turning a small screwdriver between his fingers with that farmer's patience. At one point Harris spoke without lifting his head. "Bennett," he said. "Yes, sir." "Hand me that wrench." I passed it to him. The metal was cold. His hands were steady. That was something I remember clearly now, standing there in that Savannah auditorium all those years later. How steady everyone's hands were. Not because we were fearless. But because someone had to be calm enough to finish the work. The repair took hours. We finished sometime just before dawn. By then the lantern had burned low and the sky outside the tent had begun turning that strange gray color mornings have before the sun arrives. The wind had died down. The field had grown quiet. Harris wiped his hands on a rag and leaned back slightly, examining the work. "That'll do," he said. Simple words. But in places like that they carry the weight of relief. Tommy stretched his back and stepped outside to breathe the cold morning air. I followed a minute later. The sky was opening slowly over the horizon. Engines would start soon. Vehicles would move. Planes would lift. People whose names history would remember would climb into machines that worked because someone had stayed up all night with a lantern and a wrench. I didn't think about courage then. None of us did. We just finished the work and waited for the next thing that needed fixing. That was the memory I shared. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't try to make it dramatic. The microphone carried my words softly across the Savannah auditorium, the same way the lantern had carried its small circle of light across that repair tent decades earlier. As I spoke, the room grew very quiet. Programs stopped rustling. The ceiling fans kept turning slowly overhead. I noticed the young reporter near the podium. His pen had stopped moving. He was watching. Not with embarrassment. More like someone realizing they'd just been shown a door they hadn't noticed before. When I finished, I paused for a moment and picked up my cap from the podium. "That's all," I said. "No lesson. No correction. Just a memory." For a second the room held that silence. Then someone in the middle rows began to clap. Just one person. Then another. Soon the whole auditorium filled with applause. It was warm. Respectful. But I remember thinking something funny while it happened. Applause always comes after the work is done. I nodded once, set the microphone back where it had been, and stepped away. The polished wooden floor echoed softly under my shoes as I walked back down the aisle. A few people reached out and touched my arm as I passed. Not stopping me. Just acknowledging something they'd heard. When I returned to my chair, the Navy veteran ahead of me turned halfway around. He didn't say anything. Just gave a small nod. That kind of nod men share when words would feel unnecessary. The ceremony continued after that. Speeches. Photos. People shaking hands. The young reporter approached me before the crowd began to thin. He looked a little nervous. "Sir," he said, "I hope my comment earlier didn't." I shook my head gently. "You didn't mean harm," I told him. He nodded slowly. "I just never thought about it that way." I smiled. Most people haven't. History has a habit of shining bright lights on the front of the stage. But behind that light there's always a wide shadow filled with people holding tools, tightening bolts, carrying supplies, watching gauges, staying awake through long quiet hours. Without them, the spotlight wouldn't have anything to shine on. When the ceremony ended, the crowd drifted out into the Savannah afternoon. The sun had warmed the brick streets outside. Traffic moved slowly through downtown. Somewhere a church bell rang. I walked to my truck and sat for a moment before starting the engine. The cap rested on the passenger seat. The same worn stitching. The same quiet reminder of a younger man who once stood under a lantern with grease on his hands. I thought about the applause in that auditorium. It had been kind. But what stayed with me longer was the silence before it. That moment when a room full of people realized that courage doesn't always wear medals or stand at podiums. Sometimes it just finishes the work. I started the truck and drove slowly through the old streets of Savannah. Spanish moss hung from the trees like soft gray curtains. People crossed sidewalks carrying small American flags. The world moved on the way it always does. And that felt right to me. Because the truth is, most of the things that keep the world moving forward happen quietly. A mechanic tightening one last bolt before dawn. A nurse checking a patient long after visiting hours. A father fixing a loose step so his children don't trip. No applause. No spotlight. Just responsibility carried out with steady hands. By the time I reached home the sun had started to lower in the sky. I sat in the driveway for a moment before going inside. The house was quiet. It had been quiet ever since my wife passed. But that day the quiet felt gentle. Not empty. Just peaceful. I took the cap from the passenger seat and placed it on the small table by the door. The same place it had rested for years. Then I turned off the lights and let the evening settle over the house. And I remember thinking, as the room grew still, that dignity doesn't come from being noticed. It comes from knowing you carried your part of the weight, even when no one was looking.